Good morning, criminology. So this week we are on week 6. So we are moving on to biosocial approaches. I do want to say this before I begin the lecture. So this is chapter 10. But take care of yourselves. I find myself almost working 7 days a week with all of the classes that I'm teaching, and literally sometimes on the verge of tears just because there's so much technology, there's so much extra that we have to do above and beyond. It feels like I literally have 2 full-time jobs, and it can become overwhelming. I already deal with anxiety, and it has literally, this time has triggered it. So just take care of yourself. So make sure, I have decided that I'm just going to continue on with the holidays that we are supposed to observe, that the college observes. Those are days off. Take them. And if you don't have to do anything on those days, don't do anything at all. Okay, so Columbus Day, although I don't specifically observe Columbus Day, I did take that Monday off just to detach from everything, for my own sanity. Okay, so I think I've reached out to all of you in regards to any emails that you guys sent, but this week you have to complete the first exam. So you have today, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to complete those, and just read chapter 10 on biosocial approaches. This lecture is on chapter 10, biosocial approaches. So I'm just going to begin and we can get into chapter 10. As usual, I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and you should be able to see exactly what I'm seeing right now. So again, chapter 10 is on biosocial approaches. In this chapter, as usual, as in all of the other chapters, there are some learning objectives that you need to make sure that you acquire after completing all your tasks. So that's after completing your reading, maybe after watching the lecture, maybe after doing your discussions, etc. So one thing that you guys need to get out of this week is that you need to be able to explain that while all behavior is the result of genes interacting with environments, there is no gene for crime, okay? You need to be able to identify the basis of heritability and what it tells us about the gene environment correlation and interaction. You need to be able to describe how the brain soft wires itself by experience and through experience. You need to discuss the basic ideas behind an evolutionary view of criminality, describe multiple biological risk factors for criminology, evaluate the biosocial perspective and approach, and lastly, be able to debate the policy implications of biosocial criminology. Okay. And again, you can find those learning objectives at the beginning of chapter 10. Okay. So let's get into it. The biosocial approach. Biosocial theories have been popular with mainstream social scientists until relatively recently because they were interpreted as sort of a biological determinism. There are still people who fear that biological theories can be used for nasty purposes. I, as a sociologist, predominantly, that is one of the fears that we have in sociology, where biology can be used to harm people. And it's not, I'm not saying that biology is used to harm people today, but there is a history, there is a pattern, not just within the United States, but the United States included, where biological theories have been published, research has been published and used to punish individuals, punish groups of people based on race, class, gender, etc. So poverty, right? Their theories were, we don't use these theories today, but there were theories in regards to genes being responsible in making people lazy, making people poor, And so these types of individuals would be housed in mental institutions, predominantly women too, okay? Different types of, biological theories in regards to race and ethnicity that were used to implement segregational practices, which includes like education, housing, etc., even incarcerate certain individuals. Okay, so I'm not saying that this stuff is still valid today, but there are lingering and lasting effects. Okay. Edwin Sutherland said that we can no longer pretend that biology is not intimately implicated in human behavior and thus in criminal behavior. Biosocial criminologists assert that any trait, characteristic, or behavior of any living thing is always the result of biological factors interacting with environmental factors, which is why we call modern biologically informed criminology biosocial rather than biological. Okay? Biosocial criminology is not a theory per se, but rather it is a way of looking at criminal behavior from a wide array of biologically informed theories and methodologies. So moving into behavioral genetics. Behavioral genetics studies the relative contributions of heredity and environment to behavioral and personality characteristics. Genotype is the sum of the genes we get from our parents, okay? So again, genotype is the sum of genes that we get from our parents. Genes and environments work together to develop any observable and measurable trait. This can be height, this can be weight, this can be, etc., so on. The sum of which constitutes the person's phenotype. Okay, so phenotype is the observable and measurable behavioral and personality characteristics. Okay. And then genes make up proteins which then make up neurotransmitters responsible for how we behave, we feel, etc. So neurotransmitters help us to feel. Okay. Genes lead to certain personality traits. Again, how did you get up here? Sorry, my cat. Edie, Papa, come here. How did you get up here? How'd you get up here, pups? So I have a Mancoon. I don't know if you guys see him, but he's a very large cat. I'm so sorry. Pause. Okay, and just picking up where I left off, sorry for that little disturbance, but actually, let me rewind back to that slide. So we got on to behavioral genetics, right? Behavioral genetics studies the relative contributions of heredity and environment to behavioral and personality characteristics. Genotype, again, is the sum of genes we get, particularly from our parents. Genes and environments, they work together to develop any observable and measurable traits such as height, weight, and so on, the sum of which constitutes the person's phenotype. And for those of you who don't recall, again, a phenotype is the observable and measurable behavioral and personality characteristics of any living thing as a result of genes interacting specifically with the environment. And lastly, before I was interrupted, genes make proteins, which then make up neurotransmitters responsible for how we behave or feel. They do not cause us to behave or feel a certain way, okay? So here's where we left off. Thus, again, remember from the slide I just went over, genes make up proteins, which then make up neurotransmitters that are responsible for how we behave or feel. They do not cause us to behave or feel a certain way. Thus, there are no genes for criminal behavior, but there are genes that lead to particular traits, such as having low empathy or being impulsive, that increase the probability of criminal behavior when combined with certain environments. So there are genes that lead to us having certain types of traits. So there can be a gene that leads me to be less empathetic than others. And I could move to a different area and again, that area would be an environment where that environment might foster, that trait in me being a low empath or lacking empathy, but it could foster my criminal behavior. Does that make sense? Okay. Biosocial criminologists use twins and adoption studies that make use of genetic relatedness to disentangle the relative influence of genes and environments. And they tell us that genes and environments are always jointly responsible for any human characteristic, okay? Gene expression always depends on the environment. So remember that. Gene expression will always depend on the environment. Behavioral geneticists study phenotypes and decompose the total variance in those phenotypes into 3 constituent parts: heredity, the shared environment, and the non-shared environment. Variance is a concept that quantifies the amount of difference observed in the outcomes of interest. Again, just quickly. Again, behavioral geneticists study phenotypes and decompose the total variance in those phenotypes into 3 constituent parts. Those are heredity, the shared environment, and the non-shared environment. Researchers quantify the extent to which genes influence a trait with a measure called heritability, which is also a measure of environment effects. The environmental effects on a trait are divided into shared and non-shared. The shared environment refers to the environment experienced by children reared in the same family. So like parental, socioeconomic status, religion, values, attitudes, parenting style, family size, intactness of home and the neighborhood. And it's also assumed to make them similar. Okay, so a shared environment is the environment experienced by children reared in the same family, and it's assumed to make them similar. A non-shared environment is a unique environmental experience that makes children from the same family different. Okay, so again, a non-shared environment refers to the uniqueness or to unique environmental experiences that make children from the same family different. It can be familial and non-familial, okay? It is consistently found that shared environmental effects on cognitive and personality traits, although moderate during childhood, disappear almost completely during adulthood. The non-shared features of the environment appear to be much more salient than shared environment with respect to the formation of an individual's personality and cognitive traits. Genetic effects on personality and cognitive traits, however, continue to increase throughout the lifespan. Moving on to, we're still dealing with behavioral genetics, but going into gene environment and interaction and correlation. Gene environment interaction and gene environment correlation describe people's active transactions with their environment. Gene environment interaction involves the common sense notion that people are differentially sensitive to identical environmental influences and will thus respond in different ways to them. So, gene environment correlation means that genotypes and environments are related. And there are also 3 types of gene environment correlations. There are passive, active, and evocative. Okay? So going into all 3 of those. Passive, again, gene environment correlations. Okay? Passive is the positive association between genes and their environment due to biological parents providing children with genes linked to certain traits and environments favorable for their expression. Evocative gene environmental correlation refers to the ways that others react to the individual on the basis of his or her evocative behavior. Okay? One more time, evocative environmental correlation refers to the ways others react to the individual on the basis of his or her evocative behavior. It thus also can serve to magnify phenotypic differences by funneling individuals into like-minded peer groups. And lastly, active environmental correlations refer to the active seeking of environments compatible with our genetic disposition. It becomes more pertinent as we mature and acquire the ability to take greater control over our lives and of our lives. Active environmental correlation ensures us that our minds and personalities are not simply products of external forces and that our choices are not passive responses to social forces and situations. Still continuing on with behavioral genetics, let's get into behavioral genetics and criminal behavior, okay? Behavioral genetics studies are of immense importance in helping to better understand traditional criminological theories. For instance, in the previous chapter, in chapter 9, we saw how different family structures predicted antisocial behavior in large studies in both the United States and the United Kingdom, specifically in Wales. Okay? Both studies showed that genetic factors play a large part in sorting individuals into those structures. Genes contribute to the choices people make as well as, how do I say it? Genes contribute to the choices people make as well as make them easy or make them difficult to live with, okay? One of these factors influencing choice is low self-control. While we all have to be taught to control our impulses, some of us are naturally easier to teach than others. Levels of serotonin are governed by both genes and the environment. In terms of differential association theory and its concern with peer effects, Cleveland, Weeb, and Robe found that genetic factors accounted for 64% of the variance in delinquent peer affiliation. So, unlike the relatively strong genetic influences discovered for most human traits, genetic influence on antisocial behavior is modest, especially during the teenage years. Okay. Crime and delinquency are the results of traits interacting with incentives and disincentives, as well as how well one has learned one's moral lessons. Strong genetic effects on antisocial behavior are most likely to be found only among chronic offenders who begin offending prior to puberty continue to do so throughout the life course and commit a disproportionate amount of serious offenses. Okay, so it's important, again, that you understand, serotonin and impulse control, especially in adolescence, and delinquency and crime, and how those all link up, are compared and contrast, correlated, etc. And then how we explain crime as a result of traits. Okay, not genes, but traits. This figure, again, pulled from chapter 10. It's the first figure that you will see in your chapter. And it's just a figure illustrating the passive, evocative, and active gene interaction and correlation effects using an individual mic. So pause here, take a glance at this, and then we'll continue. Continuing on with our section on behavioral genetics, but moving on to molecular genetics, okay? Heritability estimates tell us that genes are contributing to a trait, but they do not tell us which genes. Only molecular genetics can tell us this. We can now go straight to DNA by genotyping individuals with a simple cheek swab. One then will look at the effects of a particular type of genes amongst individuals who have them and those who do not. Alleles are important in this specific section of our book. An allele is an alternate form of the same gene. Every person has the same genes that make us human, but we can be differentiated based on our alleles. Again, alleles are the alternate form of the gene, okay? Any individual gene accounts for only a minuscule portion of the variance in criminal behavior, and it contributes to a trait linked to criminality, not to criminality itself, which is a composite of many different traits. Genetic polymorphism. Again, polymorphism are differences in DNA sequences that code for the same gene, but may make more or less of a substance or affect the gene's efficiency, which leads to slightly different functional or physical traits amongst individuals. Okay. Our third section of chapter 10 goes into the neurosciences. But within neurosciences, we're going to start off with soft wiring the brain by experience. All of our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions, and behaviors are the results of networks of billions of brain cells called neurons communicating with one another through substances called neurotransmitters. Criminologists are most interested in dopamine and serotonin. Neuroscientists differentiate between two processes of brain development: experience expected and experience dependent. Experience expected, in regards to that, experience expected mechanisms are hardwired and reflect the history of the brain in our species. Experience expected processes have evolved as the brain's readiness during certain critical periods for us to incorporate environmental information that is always present in our natural environment. Experience dependent mechanisms reflect the history of each person and the brain's ability to adjust itself to the environment. Experience-dependent processes are central to understanding personality as a dynamic developmental construct that involves the collaboration of genetic and environmental influences across the lifespan. The brain literally wires itself in ways reflecting the experience of its owner. Okay. Perry and Pollard, who are mentioned in our textbook, have stated experience in adults alter the organized brain, but in infants and in children, it organizes the developing brain. A brain organized by negative events is ripe for all kinds of antisocial behavior. Going into reward dominance and prefrontal dysfunctional theories, okay? Reward dominance theory, RDT, relates to how sensitive people are to rewards and punishments. Behavioral activating system, BAS, is associated with the neurotransmitter dopamine and with pleasure areas in the brain. BAS is sensitive to reward and motivates a person to seek rewarding stimuli. Okay. Behavioral inhibition system, BIS, is associated with serotonin and with brain structures that govern memory. The BIS is sensitive to threats of punishment and can be likened to a brake that stops a person from going too far, too fast. Okay. While most of us are more or less equally sensitive to both reward and punishment, meaning that the BAS and BIS are in balance, in some people, one system might be more dominant than the other most of the time. The theory asserts that criminals, especially chronic criminals, have a dominant BAS, which tends to make them more overly sensitive to reward cues and relatively insensitive to punishment cues. The reward dominance theory provides us with hard physical evidence relating to the concepts of sensation seeking, impulsiveness, and low self-control, since each of these traits is underlain by either a lack of dopamine. So the person engages more in the kinds of behavior that raises it or lowers serotonin, okay? A third system of behavioral control is the fight-flight system, so FFS. So FFS chemically is controlled by epinephrine or adrenaline. The FFS is that part of the automatic nervous system that mobilizes the body for vigorous action in response to threats by pumping out epinephrine. Another neurologically specific theory of criminal behavior is prefrontal dysfunction theory, okay? So PFC. The human prefrontal cortex, the PFC, is part of the brain located just above the eyes that occupies about 1/3 of the cerebral cortex. The PFC is responsible for things such as making moral judgments, planning, analyzing, synthesizing, and modulating emotions. PFC functions are involved in pro-social behavior. If these functions are compromised in some way via damage to the PFC, the result is often antisocial behavior. Okay, again, a figure from chapter 10, okay, this is the major dopamine and serotonin pathways in the brain. So the major dopamine is illustrated in the light gray, and the serotonin is in the darker shaded area, the black. Okay. So pause, view it here. Moving on to evolutionary psychology, okay? The usefulness of an evolutionary framework, okay? The evolutionary psychology explores human behavior using an evolutionary theoretical framework. Criminologists operating within this framework explore how certain behaviors that society now calls criminal may have been adaptive. Adaptive behavior is any behavior that contributes directly or indirectly to an individual's survival and reproductive success. Okay. Evolutionary psychology complements genetics because it informs us how the genes of interest came to be present in the human gene pool in the first place. This is an example of natural selection. Evolutionary theory explains why there are consistent behavioral patterns amongst humans across cultures, thus looking for similarities amongst humans, whereas genetics focuses on what's different or what differentiates us all. Evolutionary psychologists agree with most criminologists that although it is morally regrettable, crime is normal behavior for which everyone has the potential.